The prairie stretched wide and merciless beneath a pale Wyoming sky. The wind carried a dry, lonely song over miles of dust and broken grass. In that endless land of silence, a woman walked, thin, tired, and trembling, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, two small children clinging to her skirt. Her name was Clara Whitlow, though the folks who remembered her spoke her name only in whispers now. They called her the Widow, ever since her husband's wagon had broken under the storm last winter and never come home. She'd buried him herself, with hands that were more bone than flesh. And when the last of her cornmeal was gone, and the creek froze solid, Clara did the only thing left a mother could do. She started walking, praying that somewhere on this barren earth, mercy still lived. By the 5th day her voice was gone. The children no longer cried. Their little faces were hollow, lips cracked, eyes dull. Clara stumbled along the dirt road toward a spread of land, fenced in by cedar rails. A ranch she'd heard of once, owned by a man named Eli Carter. Folks said he'd fought in the war, come back with a scar running from his jaw to his neck and a heart that didn't speak much anymore. They said his land was harsh, but his hands were steady, and that was all Clara needed to hope for, steadiness just once. When she reached the gate, the sun was sinking low, painting the prairie in red and sorrow. Eli stepped out of his barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his shirt streaked with dust and sweat. He saw the woman first, then the children behind her, and stopped. Her lips parted, but the words barely made a sound. We haven't eaten in 5 days, she whispered. The rancher's jaw tightened. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her, really looked, and saw what pride was left in her eyes. Then he turned, went inside, and came back with half a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He held it out to her without a word. Clara's fingers trembled as she took it, breaking it into pieces for the children first. She didn't eat until they were full. Eli watched her, the way she waited, the way her hands shook, and something old stirred inside him, something he thought the war and years of solitude had buried. "You'll stay the night," he said quietly. "Storm's coming." No sense facing it empty-bellied. Inside the ranch house, the smell of stew and firewood wrapped around them like a blanket. The children sat close to the hearth, half asleep with full bellies. Clara sat near the window, the firelight glinting off her hair. For the first time in months, she felt warmth that wasn't just from the flames. Eli sat across from her, his hat resting on the table. "You from the Whitlow farm?" he asked finally. She nodded, eyes down. "Used to be," she said. "The land took everything but my name." There was silence, the kind that speaks heavier than words. Eli looked at her hands, red and raw from cold. "Ain't right," he said after a while. "A woman shouldn't have to beg to keep her children alive." Clara's lips trembled, but she forced a smile. Begging's easy when pride's already been spent. He admired her courage, though she couldn't see it. He admired the way she still sat straight, despite the hunger and the grief. He didn't know what made him speak next. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe the kindness she brought into his quiet house. But his voice softened. "You'll have work here if you want it, meals, a bed, safety." Her eyes lifted, uncertain. "You don't even know me." Eli's gaze met hers. "I know you're standing when most would have fallen. That's enough for me." That night the wind came hard and cold, rattling the windows like ghosts that refused to rest. The children slept by the fire. Eli sat in his chair, mending a rope with quiet hands. Clara stitched one of his shirts, the thread trembling between her fingers. Neither spoke for a long while, yet something passed between them, something small and sacred, born not of passion, but of shared silence. When the fire dimmed, Clara looked at him, her voice soft. "You've done more for us than I can repay." Eli shook his head. "Don't reckon it's payment I'm after." Outside, snow began to fall, soft, slow flakes drifting over the roof and the corral. The storm he'd warned her about had come, but inside the house, it felt like the world had paused, like the cold couldn't reach them anymore. As she tucked her children beneath a blanket, Eli spoke again, almost to himself. "This house has been too quiet too long. It's good. Having folks in it again. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes shining with tired gratitude. You've got a kind heart, Mr. Carter. He looked into the fire, his voice barely above a whisper. Ain't sure about kind. Just seems wrong to let good souls starve while I've got more than I need. When she went to sleep that night, curled near her children, Eli watched from the doorway for a moment. He saw her face softened by the glow, the lines of worry easing for the first time. He thought of the bread he'd given her, and how strange it was that a single loaf could change the sound of a man's heart. Before dawn, he rose early to fetch water from the well. The world was white now, the fences buried in snow. He looked back at the house and saw smoke curling steady from the chimney. For years, he'd thought he was the last living thing on this land. But now something had shifted, a promise he hadn't made but already felt bound to. Inside, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and a crackling fire. Her children were laughing softly, chasing each other with the energy only warmth can bring. When she stepped into the kitchen, Eli was there, setting a tin cup before her. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," she replied. For a long moment, they just stood there, the quiet between them softer than the falling snow. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm tin and whispered almost shyly, "I don't know how to thank you." Eli looked at her then, his eyes steady, voice low. "Then don't. Just stay." The words hung in the air like a promise, one that neither needed to speak again to understand. Outside, the storm began to fade, sunlight breaking through the clouds. The widow and her children had found shelter, and perhaps something more. And the rancher who'd once lived only for the land found something he hadn't known he was missing, a reason to keep the fire burning. Winter passed slow that year, like an old man taking careful steps. The storm that had nearly swallowed the prairie in December gave way to soft grey mornings and the cry of meadowlarks. On Eli Carter's ranch, life had taken on a rhythm again, different from before but better, warmer. The widow, Clara Whitlow, had stayed. She'd meant to leave after the first thaw, she told him, just long enough to help mend fences and cook a few suppers as payment for his kindness. But 1 week turned into two into a month, and soon the house that had once echoed with nothing but the wind now hummed with laughter and the light footsteps of children. Eli didn't say much about it, but the truth was written plain across his weathered face. He was a man who had known too much silence, and her presence had filled it with something sacred. Clara worked from dawn to dusk, mending clothes, baking bread, teaching her children their letters by the firelight. Eli tried to pay her, but she'd always shake her head and say, "You've paid enough already." Still, he found himself leaving small things for her on the table, spools of thread, a new comb, a small carved horse for her son, Annie's favorite peppermint stick for her daughter. Each time she'd notice but never mention it aloud. Instead, she'd smile that shy, tired smile that warmed him more than coffee ever could. When spring finally came, the prairie woke in 1,000 shades of gold. Cattle grazed in fat herds, and the air smelled of new life. Eli stood on the porch one morning, watching Clara hang laundry under a rising sun. The children were chasing each other around the water trough, their laughter floating like music across the yard. He'd never known what peace felt like until then. But with peace came fear, the kind that whispers that good things don't last forever. He knew she'd still carry the name of another man, a past too heavy to set down easy. And he wasn't sure he had the right to ask her to stay longer than she already had. That night after supper, Clara found him out by the corral, fixing a broken latch. "You work too much," she said softly, stepping close enough that her shawl brushed his arm. He smiled faintly without looking up. "You sound like my mother. She must have been a wise woman." "She was," he said, tightening a nail. "Died young, though. Life's hard on women out here." Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, "Hard on men, too." He looked at her then, eyes deep as twilight. "Maybe, but you've carried more weight than most men I've known." The words caught her off guard. She turned away, blinking back a tear. "I just did what I had to. Any mother would." Eli set down his hammer, leaning on the fence. You did more than that, Clara. You didn't just survive. You kept those little ones alive when the world had already quit on you. That takes grit and grace. She looked at him long and hard, her breath misting in the cool night. You don't owe us anything, Eli. You gave us food when we were starving. Shelter when no one else would open their door. You've already done more than any man had reason to. Eli's jaw tightened. Maybe I didn't do it out of reason. The silence between them turned soft then, filled with all the things neither dared to say. The moon rose slow and full, laying silver across the land. Clara's children were asleep inside, and for the first time since she'd buried her husband, she didn't feel alone beneath that vast Wyoming sky. Days turned into weeks. They rode fences together, planted a small garden behind the barn, and mended what the winter had broken. Sometimes he'd catch her singing to the children, voice quiet and sweet like wind in tall grass. Sometimes she'd catch him looking her way when he thought she wasn't watching. The loneliness that had once haunted the ranch now lived only in memory. One evening, while the sun bled gold over the hills, Clara set a loaf of fresh bread on the table. "You've been good to us," she said. "I'd like to make sure you're fed proper before we go." Eli froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "We'll go." She hesitated, eyes on the bread she'd baked. "You took us in when we had nothing." "But I can't stay forever, Eli. Folks will talk. A widow and her children living under a man's roof without name or promise. It's not right." Eli set his fork down slowly. "I ain't never cared much for what folks say. But if it's a name you're worried about..." He stopped, voice rough, searching for words that didn't come easy to him. "Then maybe it's time I gave you mine." Clara's breath caught. "Eli..." He stood, removing his hat, the sunset catching the lines on his face. "I ain't good with fancy words, Clara. I ain't rich or gentle or anything a woman deserves. But this ranch, it's lonely without you. I'm lonely without you, you and those young'uns. You belong here if you'll have it." Her hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the table. The world seemed to blur for a moment. The sound of the children's laughter outside, the soft creak of the windmill turning slow. Tears filled her eyes. "You're asking me to marry you?" He nodded once. "Reckon I am. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because when I think of home now, it's not these walls, it's you." The tears fell then, silent and full. Clara crossed the small space between them and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. "You gave me bread when I was starving," she whispered. "You gave my children safety. And now you're offering your name. Eli Carter, there ain't a richer man alive in my eyes." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that softened the scar along his jaw. Then it settled. They married under the cottonwood tree behind the house a week later. No preacher, no music, no witnesses but the children and the wind. Eli slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, one he'd bought long ago but never found reason to give. Clara's daughter scattered wildflowers across the dirt, and her boy stood proud beside them, holding Eli's hat like it was a crown. When the vows were spoken and the promise sealed with a shy kiss, the prairie seemed to exhale. The wind carried the scent of spring grass, and for the first time the land felt alive again. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ranch in orange light, Clara stood at the fence where it had all begun, the place she'd once whispered. "We haven't eaten in 5 days." She looked toward the house, where her children chased each other through the doorway, and where Eli waited by the porch, smiling the way a man does when he's finally come home. Clara's voice caught in her throat as she whispered, "We've come a long way." Eli stepped beside her, arms sliding gently around her shoulders. "Ain't done yet," he said with a grin. "We got more years ahead than behind." She leaned into him, the warmth of his hand steady and sure. The horizon stretched wide and gold before them, endless as hope itself. The widow, who'd once begged for bread, now shared her life with the man who gave it, and his last name. And on that quiet stretch of land beneath the Wyoming sky, love had taken root deeper than any storm could ever reach.